My name is Rebecca, and I am the villain of this story. Not the misunderstood anti-hero, not the victim who made bad choices. I am the person who deliberately chose to destroy my family with 4 words sent in a text message. You're not even his daughter. Send. I watched her phone light up across the dinner table 3 months ago. I watched my sister Sarah's face change from confusion to horror to complete devastation in the span of 15 seconds. I watched her hands start trembling as she read those words over and over again. I watched the color drain from her face like someone had pulled a plug. I watched her show the screen to our father with shaking hands, and I watched his face crumble like a building in an earthquake. And you know what? In that moment, part of me felt satisfied. Part of me felt vindicated. Part of me felt like justice was finally being served after 28 years of living in the shadow of a lie. You think I'm a monster. You're probably right. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story doesn't start with that text message. It doesn't start with that dinner where Sarah collapsed and everyone cried. It starts 28 years ago when my parents brought home a baby they claimed was their miracle child, and even at 5 years old, I knew something was wrong. I remember the day they brought Sarah home. I remember sitting on the couch in our old house on Maple Street, wearing my favorite purple dress with the flowers on it, waiting to meet my new baby sister. Mom and Dad had been gone for 3 days, and Grandma kept telling me they were at the hospital bringing home my new sibling. I was so excited. I had been begging for a brother or sister for years. But when they walked through that door, something felt off. Mom wasn't tired like I expected her to be. She wasn't moving carefully like Mrs. Johnson next door had after she had her baby. Dad was carrying this tiny bundle, and they both looked nervous in a way I couldn't understand at the time. Not happy nervous, like expecting parents should be. Scared nervous, guilty nervous. "Rebecca, come meet your baby sister Sarah," Mom said, but her voice was weird, shaky, like she was reading from a script she hadn't memorized properly. I walked over and looked at this tiny red face peeking out from a pink blanket. And even at 5 years old, I knew this baby looked nothing like us. Nothing like Mom with her dark hair and olive skin. Nothing like Dad with his blue eyes and freckles. Nothing like me with my brown curls and round face. This baby had blonde hair so light it was almost white, and when she opened her eyes, they were green like emeralds. "She's beautiful," I said, because that's what you're supposed to say about babies. But inside, my 5-year-old brain was working, over time trying to figure out why this baby looked like she belonged to completely different parents. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other things that didn't make sense. There were no pictures of Mom pregnant. None. I had seen photo albums of other families, and there were always pictures of the mom with her big belly, touching it and smiling. But when I asked to see pictures of Mom when she was pregnant with Sarah, she would get flustered and change the subject. There were no baby clothes prepared in advance. When Sarah arrived, suddenly there were shopping bags everywhere, like they had rushed out to buy everything at the last minute. I remembered when Mrs. Johnson was pregnant, she had spent months preparing the nursery, washing tiny clothes, organizing bottles and diapers. But Sarah's room looked like it had been thrown together overnight. And then there were the phone calls. Hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked into the room. I would catch fragments. No one can know. The paperwork. What if someone finds out? These weren't the conversations of happy new parents. These were the conversations of people hiding something. But I was 5. What did I know? I pushed these observations to the back of my mind and tried to be a good big sister. I helped with feedings. I sang to Sarah when she cried. I protected her from the neighborhood kids who sometimes teased her about looking different from the rest of us. I loved her, genuinely and completely, the way you love family. For years, I convinced myself that my childhood observations had been wrong, that I had imagined the strangeness surrounding Sarah's arrival, that families just looked different sometimes, and that was normal. I threw myself into being the best big sister I could be. But as we grew older, the differences became impossible to ignore. Not just physical differences, though those were stark enough. Sarah excelled at everything effortlessly while I struggled for every achievement. She was naturally athletic while I was clumsy. She was academically gifted while I fought for average grades. She was socially graceful while I was awkward and anxious. The worst part wasn't that Sarah was better at everything. The worst part was how our parents responded to these differences. Every one of Sarah's achievements was celebrated, like a miracle. Every one of mine was met with polite acknowledgement and immediate comparison to what Sarah had done at the same age. Sarah was reading chapter books by age 6, Mom would say when I brought home a good report card at 7. Sarah never had trouble with math, Dad would sigh when I struggled with homework. Sarah is just naturally gifted, they would tell. Teachers, neighbors, relatives, anyone who would listen. Some people are born special. And what was I? What did that make me? The implication was clear. I was ordinary. Unremarkable. The practice round before they got their real daughter. By the time I was 13, I had developed a theory that I was too afraid to voice. Maybe I was adopted. Maybe that's why I felt so different, so disconnected from this family that seemed to revolve around Sarah, like she was the sun and the rest of us were just planets in her orbit. It would explain everything. Why I looked different, why I struggled where she succeeded, why my parents seemed to love her more. But when I finally worked up the courage to ask Mom if I was adopted, she laughed. Actually laughed. Rebecca, honey, you're being ridiculous. You look exactly like your father's side of the family. You have his stubborn chin and his terrible eyesight. Of course you're not adopted. What a silly question. And she was right. I did look like Dad's family. I had inherited his nearsightedness, his tendency toward anxiety, his way of chewing his lip when he was thinking. I was clearly their biological child, which meant Sarah was too, right? Which meant all my suspicions and observations were just the paranoid delusions of a jealous older sister. So I buried my doubts deeper and tried harder to be grateful for what I had. I tried to celebrate Sarah's successes without resentment. I tried to accept that some people are just naturally more gifted, more loved, more special. I tried to find my own path and my own identity separate from being Sarah's less impressive older sister. But the questions never completely went away. They lived in the back of my mind like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. And as we moved into our teenage years, as the differences between us became even more pronounced, as my parents' favoritism became even more obvious, that itch started to demand attention. The truth was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. And when it finally arrived, it would change everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself, and about the sister I had spent my whole life both loving and resenting. High school was when the favoritism became impossible to ignore. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant, shameless, and devastating to watch. Sarah glided through those 4 years like she was starring in her own personal success story, while I stumbled through mine like an extra in someone else's movie. Sarah was valedictorian, naturally. She was student body president, captain of the debate team, and lead in every school play. She played 3 instruments, spoke 2 languages fluently, and volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. Her college applications read like a fantasy novel about the perfect teenager. I, meanwhile, was fighting to maintain a B average. I joined clubs but never got leadership positions. I tried out for sports but warmed benches. I auditioned for plays but got cast as townsperson number 3 if I was lucky. My guidance counselor suggested community college as a realistic option, while Sarah's guidance counselor was helping her choose between Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But the real knife in my heart wasn't the academic differences. It was watching how our parents responded to each of us. When Sarah brought home her acceptance letter to Harvard with a full scholarship, Dad actually cried. He called everyone we knew. He posted about it on Facebook with a paragraph about how proud he was of his brilliant, accomplished daughter. Mom framed the letter and hung it in the living room where everyone could see it. When I brought home my acceptance letter to the Akir local community college, they said, "That's nice, honey," and asked if I had seen Sarah's latest award from the National Honor Society. The money situation was even worse. Sarah never wanted for anything. New laptop for school? Done. Designer clothes for special events? Of course. Summer programs in Europe? They'd find a way to make it work. But when I needed money for textbooks or wanted to join my friends for a weekend trip, suddenly the budget was tight. Suddenly we needed to be more careful with money and think about priorities. I started working at 16, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. If I wanted anything beyond the bare necessities, I had to pay for it myself. Sarah never worked a day in high school. Her job is to focus on her studies, Mom would say. She's going places, and where was I going? Apparently nowhere that mattered. The breaking point came during my senior year. I had been working 2 part-time jobs, one at a coffee shop after school and one at a retail store on weekends, trying to save money for college. I was exhausted constantly, my grades were suffering, and I felt like I was drowning. Meanwhile, Sarah was being courted by Ivy League schools and planning her bright future. One night, I overheard a conversation between my parents that changed everything. I had come home late from my evening shift at the coffee shop, and I could hear them talking in the kitchen. I was about to announce myself when I heard my name. "I'm worried about Rebecca," Mom was saying. "She seems so angry all the time." "She's just jealous," Dad replied. "It's natural for siblings to compare themselves, but Rebecca needs to understand that Sarah is special. Not everyone can be exceptional." "Maybe we should try to spend more time with Rebecca," Mom suggested. "Make her feel more included." Dad sighed heavily. "We can't hold Sarah back just to make Rebecca feel better about herself. Sarah has real potential. She could change the world. Rebecca is, well, she's a good kid, but she's ordinary. We need to focus our resources where they'll make the biggest impact." I stood in that hallway, still in my coffee-stained uniform, listening to my father casually dismiss me as ordinary while praising Sarah as world-changing. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not just my heart, but my faith in my family, my sense of belonging, my belief that I mattered to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. That's when I started really paying attention to the inconsistencies I had noticed as a child. The lack of pregnancy photos, the absence of family resemblance, the nervous energy that surrounded Sarah's early years, the way my parents sometimes looked at her like they couldn't believe she was really theirs. I started researching, not casually, not out of idle curiosity, but with the methodical determination of someone who needed answers. I learned about public records, about how to request birth certificates and hospital records. I discovered DNA testing services that could be done at home with just a saliva sample. It took me 6 months to gather all the pieces, but when I did, the picture they formed was devastating. Sarah wasn't my parents' biological daughter. She was the child of my mother's sister, Lisa, who had died in a car accident when Sarah was 6 months old. Lisa had been a single mother, struggling with addiction, and when she died, my parents saw an opportunity. They had been trying for years to have another baby after me, dealing with infertility and multiple miscarriages. When Lisa died and left behind this beautiful, healthy baby girl, they made a decision that would define the next 28 years of our lives. They forged documents, they moved states. They created an entirely new identity for this baby and convinced everyone, including Sarah herself, that she was their biological miracle child, conceived after years of fertility treatments. They built an elaborate lie and lived it so completely that even they seemed to believe it sometimes. But here's the part that destroyed me. They loved her more than they ever loved me. Their actual biological daughter. The child they had tried for years to conceive before I came along. I was the practice round, the warm-up act, the placeholder until they could get their hands on someone better. They had chosen Sarah. They had fought for her, lied for her, rebuilt their entire lives around her. And me? I was just the accident that happened before they found their real daughter. For months after I discovered the truth, I walked around in a daze. I would look at my family across the dinner table and see strangers. I would listen to Sarah talk about her plans and achievements and feel like I was watching a performance. I would hear my parents praise her and feel like they were worshiping at the altar of their own deception. The worst part was that I still loved them. All of them. Even knowing what I knew, even understanding how thoroughly I had been betrayed, I couldn't just turn off 23 years of family bonds. I loved Sarah like a sister because she was my sister, even if we didn't share DNA. I loved my parents like parents because they had raised me, even if they had never truly chosen me. But love and resentment can coexist in the same heart, and mine was becoming a battlefield between the two. I started having fantasies about revealing the truth. I would imagine the look on Sarah's face when she learned that her entire identity was a lie. I would picture my parents being forced to confront the consequences of their deception. I would envision myself finally being seen, finally being acknowledged, finally being chosen. But I also imagined the destruction it would cause. The way it would shatter Sarah's sense of self. The way it would tear apart the only family I had ever known. The way it would make me the villain in everyone's story, including my own. For 5 years, I carried this secret like a bomb in my chest. 5 years of watching my parents continue to pour love, money, and opportunities into Sarah while treating me like an afterthought. 5 years of biting my tongue while Sarah got everything I had ever wanted and more. 5 years of being the forgotten daughter in a family built on lies. Until that dinner. Until I couldn't take it anymore. Until the bomb finally exploded and took everything with it. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday in March, 5 years after I had first started investigating my family's secrets. I had ordered the test kit online, swabbed my cheek and Sarah's toothbrush when she wasn't looking, and sent both samples to the lab under fake names. For 6 weeks, I had been checking my email obsessively, both desperate for and terrified of the results. When the email finally came, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the insurance office, where I worked my mundane 9-to-5 job. Sarah was finishing her second year at Harvard, studying international relations and planning to change the world. I was processing claims and trying to figure out how to pay off my student loans from community college. I opened the email with shaking hands. Results: 0% probability of full sibling relationship. 0% probability of half-sibling relationship. Subjects are not biologically related. There it was. Scientific confirmation of what I had suspected for years. Sarah and I shared no DNA. None. We weren't sisters by blood, which meant she wasn't my parents' biological daughter. Which meant everything I had discovered about Aunt Lisa and the forged documents and the elaborate deception was true. I sat in that parking lot for an hour, staring at those results, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. Part of me had hoped I was wrong. Part of me had wanted my suspicions to be the paranoid delusions of a jealous sister. But now, I had proof. And with that proof came a terrible clarity about my entire life. Every time my parents had chosen Sarah over me, they had been choosing their fantasy daughter over their real one. Every time they had praised her achievements while dismissing mine, they had been celebrating the success of their elaborate lie while ignoring the struggles of their actual child. Every time they had poured resources into her future while leaving me to fend for myself, they had been investing in their deception while abandoning their responsibility. I drove home that night in a fog of rage and grief. When I walked into the house, Sarah was there for spring break, sitting at the kitchen table with Mom and Dad, showing them photos from some study abroad program she was considering. They were hanging on her every word, asking questions, offering suggestions, completely absorbed in her world. "Hey, Rebecca," Sarah said when she saw me. "How was work?" "Fine," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange even to me. "Sarah's thinking about spending a semester in Geneva," Mom said, beaming with pride. "Can you imagine? Our little girl studying international diplomacy in Switzerland. Our little girl." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't their little girl. She was their stolen girl, their fabricated girl, their chosen girl. But she wasn't their biological daughter, and they knew it. They had always known it. "That's great," I said, and escaped to my room before anyone could see the tears starting to form. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the times I had felt like an outsider in my own family. All the times I had wondered why I didn't fit, why I wasn't enough, why I couldn't measure up to Sarah's effortless perfection. Now I knew. It wasn't because I was inadequate. It was because the game had been rigged from the start. Over the next few weeks, I found myself studying my family with new eyes. I watched how my parents interacted with Sarah versus how they interacted with me. I noticed things I had been too close to see before. With Sarah, they were attentive, engaged, invested. They asked about her classes, her friends, her plans. They offered advice and support and encouragement. They treated her opinions as valuable and her dreams as achievable. They saw her as someone with unlimited potential. With me, they were polite but distant. They asked perfunctory questions about my job and my life, but they didn't really listen to the answers. They offered generic encouragement but no real support. They treated me like a pleasant roommate rather than a beloved daughter. The difference was stark once I started paying attention, and it was devastating. I began to understand that this wasn't just about favoritism or personality differences. This was about the fundamental way they saw us. Sarah was their chosen daughter, their project, their pride and joy. I was their obligation, their burden, their reminder of what they had settled for before they found something better. The more I watched, the angrier I became. Not just at my parents, but at Sarah too. She had no idea that her entire life was built on a lie, but she had benefited from that lie every single day. She had received love and attention and resources that should have been shared equally between us. She had been lifted up while I was pushed down, and she had never questioned why. I started having conversations with myself about what to do with the information I had. Part of me wanted to confront my parents directly, to demand an explanation and an apology. Part of me wanted to tell Sarah the truth and let her deal with the consequences. Part of me wanted to expose the whole lie publicly and watch my family's perfect facade crumble. But another part of me was terrified of what would happen if I opened this Pandora's box. Would Sarah hate me for destroying her sense of identity? Would my parents cut me off completely for threatening their secret? Would I lose the only family I had ever known, even if that family had never truly chosen me? For months, I wrestled with these questions. I would draft emails to Sarah telling her the truth, then delete them. I would rehearse confrontations with my parents, then lose my nerve. I would imagine scenarios where I revealed everything, then talk myself out of it. Meanwhile, life continued as normal. Sarah excelled at Harvard and made plans for graduate school. My parents celebrated her achievements and supported her dreams. I worked my boring job and tried to build a life that didn't depend on their approval or attention. But the secret was eating me alive. Every family dinner was torture. Every phone call where they gushed about Sarah's latest accomplishment felt like a knife in my heart. Every time they treated me like an afterthought while celebrating their fake daughter, I felt myself getting closer to the breaking point. The final straw came 6 months later, at Sarah's graduation from Harvard. I had saved money for months to attend, taking time off work and paying for my own travel and hotel. My parents, of course, spared no expense. They flew first class, stayed at a luxury hotel, and threw a celebration dinner that cost more than I made in a month. At the dinner, surrounded by Sarah's friends and professors and my parents' friends, I listened to speech after speech about how proud everyone was of Sarah, how bright her future was, how lucky my parents were to have such an exceptional daughter. My father gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes, talking about how Sarah had been their miracle baby, their greatest joy, their proof that dreams really do come true. I sat at that table smiling and clapping and pretending to be happy, while inside I was screaming. Everything they were celebrating was based on a lie. Every word of praise was built on deception. Every expression of pride was stolen from the real daughter they had never bothered to truly see or value. That night, alone in my hotel room, I made a decision. I couldn't carry this secret anymore. I couldn't watch my family continue to live this lie while I slowly died inside from the weight of the truth. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when everything was fundamentally broken. I was going to tell Sarah the truth. Not out of love, not out of concern for her well-being, but out of a desperate need to make someone else carry the burden I had been carrying alone. I was going to destroy her perfect world the way mine had been destroyed when I learned the truth. I was going to become the villain in my family's story, and I was going to do it on purpose. The dinner was supposed to celebrate Sarah's promotion to senior partner at her law firm, 28 years old and already making more money than our father ever did. Of course she was. Sarah had always been destined for greatness, hadn't she? At least that's what everyone believed. I arrived at my parents' house that Friday evening with my phone already loaded with the message I'd been crafting for weeks. 4 simple words that would change everything. You're not even his daughter. I had typed and deleted variations of this message hundreds of times. She's not your real daughter. Sarah is adopted. Your precious daughter is a lie. But I kept coming back to those 4 words because they were personal, direct, and devastating. Mom had made Sarah's favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon, with roasted vegetables and that expensive wine Sarah loved. The dining room was decorated with congratulations banners, and there was even a cake from the fancy bakery downtown. Everything perfect for the perfect daughter's perfect achievement. I sat across from Sarah, watching her glow with happiness as she told us about her new corner office, her increased salary, her plans to buy a house in the suburbs. Dad hung on every word, his eyes shining with pride. Mom kept refilling Sarah's wine glass and taking pictures with her phone. "My successful daughter," she kept saying. "I'm so proud of my baby girl." Each word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. My baby girl. Their baby girl who wasn't even theirs. I had been waiting for the right moment, and it came when Dad stood up to make a toast. He raised his glass, his voice thick with emotion, and began speaking about how proud he was of Sarah, how she had exceeded every dream he'd ever had for his daughter, how she was proof that love and good parenting could create something beautiful in this world. "To Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "My daughter, my pride and joy, the light of my life. You are everything I ever hoped for in a child, and I couldn't love you more if you were my own flesh and blood." The irony of those last words was too much. If you were my own flesh and blood. But she wasn't. She was flesh and blood, just not his. And I was his actual flesh and blood, sitting right there, invisible as always. That's when I sent the message. I watched Sarah's phone light, up on the table beside her plate. I watched her glance down casually, probably expecting a congratulations text from a friend or colleague. I watched her face change as she read the words. The smile faded first, replaced by confusion. Then her eyebrows furrowed as she read it, again. Then her face went completely white. "Sarah?" Mom asked, noticing the change immediately. "Honey, what's wrong?" Sarah's hands were shaking as she picked up her phone. She looked at me across the table, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. Real, genuine fear. She knew. Somehow, in that instant, she knew I was telling the truth. "Who sent this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I could have lied. I could have pretended I didn't know what she was talking about. But I didn't want to. I wanted her to know it was me. I wanted her to know that her own sister had been the one to destroy her world. "What does it say, sweetheart?" Dad asked, moving toward her chair. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely hold the phone. She looked at me again, and I saw the exact moment she realized who had sent it. Her eyes widened, and she mouthed the word, "Why?" silently. I smiled. Actually smiled. And that's when she showed them the phone. Dad read it first. I watched his face go through the same progression Sarah's had. Confusion, then understanding, then horror. But his horror wasn't about the message itself. It was about the fact that someone knew. Someone had discovered their carefully guarded secret. "This is ridiculous," he said quickly, but his voice was shaky. "Sarah, this is obviously some kind of cruel joke. Someone's trying to upset you on your special night." But Mom had read it too now, and she wasn't as good at hiding her reaction. She actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. And that gasp told Sarah everything she needed to know. "It's true, isn't it?" Sarah said, her voice getting stronger, but more desperate. "Mom, Dad, please tell me this is a joke. Please tell me this person is lying." The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. In that silence, 28 years of lies crumbled. In that silence, Sarah's entire identity shattered. In that silence, I finally got my revenge. "Sarah," Mom finally whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Sweetheart, we can explain." And that's when Sarah collapsed. Not dramatically, not like in the movies, she just folded. Her legs gave out, and she slumped forward in her chair, her face hitting the table. The wine glass shattered, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. Dad lunged forward to catch her, but he was too late. "Call 911! Mom screamed, but Sarah was already coming around. She wasn't unconscious, just overwhelmed. She pushed Dad away when he tried to help her, pushed away the woman she'd called Mom for 28 years. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice hollow. "Don't you dare touch me." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Hatred. Pure, undiluted hatred. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've known, and you've been sitting on this, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy me." I could have denied it. I could have pretended I'd just found out, that I was as shocked as everyone else. But I was done pretending. "Yes," I said simply. "I've known for 10 years. The sound Mom made was inhuman, a wail of grief and horror and disbelief. Dad just stared at me like he'd never seen me before, like I was some stranger who had wandered into their house and destroyed their family for sport. 10 years? Sarah repeated, her voice getting stronger, angrier. "You've known for 10 years that my entire life is a lie and you said nothing. You watched me call them Mom and Dad. You watched me talk about family resemblance. You watched me plan my future based on a foundation of lies, and you said nothing?" "That's right," I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded. "I watched you get everything that should have been mine. I watched them love you more than they ever loved me, their actual daughter. I watched you be the golden child while I was treated like an afterthought. And yes, I waited for the perfect moment to take it all away from you." Sarah stood up slowly, wine dripping from her hair, her dress stained, her makeup ruined. She looked around the room at the congratulations banners, at the cake, at the family photos covering every surface, photos that now felt like evidence of a massive deception. "Who am I?" she whispered. "If I'm not Sarah Mitchell, if I'm not their daughter, then who am I?" And that's when I delivered the final blow. "You're Sarah Chen," I said. "Your real mother was Lisa Chen, Mom's sister. She died in a car accident when you were 6 months old, and they took you in and pretended you were theirs. They moved states, forged documents, and built your entire identity on a lie. You're not special, Sarah. You're not their miracle baby. You're just an orphan they decided to keep." The sound Sarah made then will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was the sound of a person's soul breaking. She doubled over like she'd been punched in the stomach, and this time when she collapsed, she didn't get back up. The aftermath of that dinner was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Everything that had seemed solid and permanent in our family structure crumbled piece by piece, and I had a front row seat to the destruction I had orchestrated. Sarah didn't speak to any of us for 3 weeks after that night. She took time off work, which was unprecedented for someone who had never taken a sick day in her life. She moved out of her apartment and into a hotel, unable to bear being surrounded by family photos and memories that now felt contaminated by lies. She blocked Mom and Dad's phone numbers, changed her locks, and hired a private investigator to uncover the truth about her real identity. I know all this because Mom called me, crying every single day, begging me to help them fix what I had broken. She would sob into the phone about how Sarah wouldn't return their calls, how she'd driven by Sarah's office building just to catch a glimpse of her, how Dad had started drinking again for the first time in 15 years. "How could you do this? To us?" she would ask over and over. "How could you destroy our family like this? Sarah is your sister. We love her. We love you. How could you be so cruel?" But I wasn't feeling cruel anymore. I was feeling empty. The satisfaction I had expected to feel, the vindication, the sense of justice, none of it came. Instead, I felt hollow, like I had carved out a piece of myself, along with the piece I had carved out of Sarah. The private investigator Sarah hired was thorough. Within 2 weeks, she had uncovered the entire truth. Lisa Chen had been Mom's younger sister, an artist who had gotten pregnant at 19 and refused to name the father. She had planned to raise the baby alone, but the car accident changed everything. Mom and Dad, who had been trying unsuccessfully to have another child for years, saw an opportunity. They were already listed as emergency contacts and had temporary custody while the state figured out what to do with the baby. Instead of going through proper adoption channels, they made a different choice. They moved from California to Oregon, where no one knew them. They created false medical records showing that Mom had given birth to Sarah. They destroyed any evidence of Lisa's existence and created a new narrative where Sarah was their biological miracle baby, conceived after years of fertility treatments. It was elaborate, illegal, and completely motivated by love. They hadn't stolen Sarah for money or malicious reasons. They had genuinely wanted to give her the best life possible, and they had convinced themselves that letting her grow up believing she was their biological daughter was the kindest thing to do. But Sarah didn't see it that way. When she finally agreed to meet with them after 3 weeks of silence, it was only to tell them that she never wanted to see them again. I wasn't there for that conversation, but Dad told me about it later. He said Sarah sat across from them in a coffee shop looking like a stranger. She had cut her hair short and dyed it black. She was wearing clothes they'd never seen before, like she was trying to shed every trace of the person she had been. "You stole my identity," she told them. "You stole my mother's memory. You made me live a lie for 28 years. You robbed me of the chance to know who I really was, where I really came from. You made every relationship I've ever had feel false because I didn't even know who I was." She told them she was changing her name back to Sarah Chen. She was quitting her job and moving to California to try to piece together information about Lisa, about her real family, about the life she should have had. She said she might forgive them someday, but that day was not today, and it might never come. "And Rebecca," she said, looking directly at Dad when she said my name, "tell Rebecca that she got what she wanted. She destroyed the perfect family she was so jealous of. I hope it was worth it." That's when I realized what I had really done. I hadn't just revealed a secret or exposed a lie. I had murdered my sister. Not literally, but the Sarah who had walked into that dinner was gone forever. The confident, successful, beloved daughter who had been the center of our family's universe had been replaced by this hollow-eyed stranger who spoke about us like we were criminals who had kidnapped her life. And maybe we were. Maybe I was. The ripple effects kept spreading. Dad's drinking got worse. He would sit in Sarah's old room for hours, holding photo albums and crying. Mom stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped functioning. She kept calling Sarah's hotel, begging the front desk to put her through, but Sarah had left instructions not to accept any calls from family. My extended family found out, of course. Secrets like this don't stay contained. Aunts and uncles and cousins who had watched Sarah grow up suddenly understood why she had never quite fit the family mold. Some of them were angry at Mom and Dad for the deception. Others were angry at me for exposing it so cruelly. Family gatherings became minefields of tension and whispered conversations. But the worst part was the way people looked at me. Not just family, but friends, coworkers, neighbors who had heard the story. They looked at me like I was a monster, and maybe I was. Maybe someone who could sit on information like that for 10 years, who could watch their sister live a lie and then choose the most devastating possible moment to reveal the truth. Maybe that person was exactly the monster they thought I was. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in family trauma. I told her everything, about the jealousy, about discovering the truth, about the 10 years of planning and waiting, about the text message and its aftermath. "What did you hope to accomplish?" she asked me during our third session. I had been expecting that question, but I still didn't have a good answer. "I wanted them to hurt the way I had been hurt," I said finally. "I wanted Sarah to know what it felt like to have your entire identity questioned. I wanted my parents to face consequences for their lies." "And do you feel like you accomplished those goals?" I thought about Sarah's hollow eyes, about Dad's drinking, about Mom's desperate phone calls. "Yes," I said. "But I don't feel good about it. What do you feel?" That was harder to answer. What did I feel? Regret? Satisfaction? Guilt? All of those things and none of them? "Empty," I said finally. "I feel empty." Dr. Martinez nodded like this made perfect sense to her. "Rebecca, you spent 10 years nurturing resentment and planning revenge. That kind of anger becomes part of your identity. When you finally acted on it, you didn't just destroy your family's foundation, you destroyed the foundation of your own identity too. The anger that had been driving you for so long was gone, and you hadn't built anything else to replace it. She was right, but knowing that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made me feel worse. I had sacrificed everything: my relationship with my sister, my parents' mental health, my family's stability, my own sense of self, for a moment of revenge that had left me feeling more empty than satisfied. 3 months after the dinner, I got a letter from Sarah. Not a text, not an email, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my apartment. My hands shook as I opened it, hoping for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for some sign that the sister I had grown up with was still in there somewhere. Instead, I got this. Rebecca, I'm writing this letter because I need you to understand something. You didn't just reveal a secret that night. You didn't just expose a lie. You murdered me. The person I was for 28 years is gone forever. And you killed her deliberately, methodically, and cruelly. You are my sister by blood, but you are dead to me now. I will never forgive you. I will never speak to you again. I will never acknowledge your existence. You got what you wanted. You destroyed the family that didn't appreciate you enough. I hope it was worth it. Sarah Chen. That letter broke something in me that I didn't even know could be broken. Because she was right. I had murdered my sister, and I had done it on purpose, and there was no taking it back. 6 months after that dinner, I was living in a different city, working a different job, trying to build a different life. But you can't outrun what you've done, especially when what you've done has fundamentally changed who you are. I had moved to Seattle, taken a job at a small marketing firm, and rented a studio apartment where I knew no one, and no one knew me. I told myself it was a fresh start, but really it was just running away. I couldn't bear to stay in Portland, where every familiar place reminded me of the family I had destroyed. The nightmares started about a month after the move. Not dramatic horror movie nightmares, but worse. Dreams where everything was normal. Dreams where Sarah and I were kids again, playing in the backyard while Mom called us in for dinner. Dreams where we were adults having normal sister conversations about work and relationships and weekend plans. Dreams where I hadn't sent that text message, where our family was still intact, where Sarah still existed. I would wake up from these dreams feeling like I had lost her all over again. Because in those dreams, I remembered what it felt like to love my sister instead of resenting her. I remembered that before the jealousy and anger took over, Sarah had been my little sister who looked up to me, who asked me for advice, who genuinely cared about my opinion. I had loved her once, before I learned to hate her. The therapy continued, but now it was focused on a different question. How do you live with yourself when you've done something unforgivable? Dr. Martinez had referred me to a colleague in Seattle, Dr. Kim, who specialized in what she called moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when you violate your own moral code. It was a term usually applied to soldiers or first responders who had been forced to make impossible choices, but apparently it also applied to people like me who had chosen to do terrible things. The hardest part, Dr. Kim explained during one of our sessions, is that you can't undo what you've done. You can't apologize your way out of it. You can't make amends that will fix it. And you can't punish yourself enough to balance the scales. You have to find a way to live with the knowledge that you are capable of causing immense harm to people you love. She was right, and that knowledge was crushing. I had always thought of myself as a good person who had been treated unfairly. I had justified my actions by focusing on my parents' deception and Sarah's privileged position in the family. But the truth was simpler and more horrible. I was someone who could plan and execute the complete destruction of another person's life, and I had done it to my own sister. The updates about my family came through mutual friends and social media. Stalking. Dad had been forced to take early retirement because his drinking had affected his work performance. Mom had started seeing a psychiatrist and was on medication for severe depression. They had sold the family house, too many memories, too much pain, and moved to a smaller place across town. Sarah had indeed moved to California and was working as a paralegal while she tried to piece together information about Lisa Chen. She had found some of Lisa's artwork and had started a small website dedicated to preserving her memory. She was seeing a therapist too, trying to rebuild her sense of identity from scratch. She had changed her name legally and had started using Chen professionally. Through careful social media investigation, I learned that she was dating someone new, a man named David who worked at the art gallery where some of Lisa's paintings were displayed. In the photos I could find, she looked different. Not just the short black hair and new clothes, but something deeper. She looked guarded, careful, like someone who had learned not to trust the fundamental assumptions about her life. I wondered if she ever thought about me, if she missed the sister she had grown up with, if she ever felt curious about my motivations or my current life. But then I would remember her letter, "You are dead to me now." And I would know that she had moved on as completely as someone can move on from a family member who is still alive. The worst part was the realization that I had gotten exactly what I thought I wanted, and it had made everything worse. Sarah was no longer the golden child because she was no longer part of the family at all. My parents' attention was no longer focused on her achievements because they were too busy grieving her loss. I was no longer competing with her for their love because there was no love left to compete for, just guilt, shame, and the wreckage of what we used to be. I had wanted to level the playing field, but instead I had burned down the entire game. 1 year after the dinner, I decided to write letters to each of them. Not to send, I knew better than to think they would want to hear from me, but to try to articulate what I had learned, what I regretted, and who I was trying to become. The letter to Sarah was the hardest. "Dear Sarah, I know you'll never read this, and I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need to say this anyway. I was wrong, not just about the way I told you the truth, but about everything. I was wrong to sit on that information for 10 years. I was wrong to choose the cruelest possible moment to reveal it. I was wrong to prioritize my own pain over yours. I was wrong to destroy your life because I was unhappy with mine. I spent so many years focusing on what I thought you had taken from me that I never appreciated what you had given me. You were a good sister. You celebrated my achievements even when they were smaller than yours. You asked for my advice even when you probably didn't need it. You included me in your life even when I was pulling away from yours. You loved me, and I repaid that love with betrayal. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't apologize my way back into your life. I know that the sister you grew up with is dead to you now, and I'm the one who killed her. But I want you to know that I see that now. I understand what I destroyed, and I will carry that knowledge for the rest of my life. I hope you find peace with who you really are. I hope you build a life that feels authentic and true. I hope you find people who love you for exactly who you are, not for who they think you should be. And I hope that someday, the pain I caused you fades enough that you can remember the good parts of who we used to be to each other. I love you, and I'm sorry. Rebecca." Writing that letter didn't make me feel better, but it did make me feel clearer. I understood now that this wasn't a story about justified revenge or family secrets or even sibling rivalry. This was a story about how someone can become so consumed by their own pain that they lose sight of everyone else's humanity, including their own. I was the villain of this story, but I was also a victim, not of my family's lies or favoritism, but of my own choices. I had chosen resentment over communication, revenge over reconciliation, destruction over healing. And now I had to live with those choices for the rest of my life. The question Dr. Kim kept asking me was, what are you going to do with the rest of your life now that you know who you're capable of being? It was a good question, and I was still working on the answer. But I knew it had to start with accepting responsibility for what I had done, not just to my family, but to myself. I had to find a way to live with the knowledge that I was capable of terrible things, while also finding a way to become someone who chose not to do terrible things. Maybe that was the real punishment for what I had done, not external consequences or other people's anger, but the internal work of becoming someone who could live with herself. Maybe that was what justice looked like when you were both the perpetrator and the judge. I was the villain of this story, but I was also the only one who could write a different ending for myself. And maybe, if I worked hard enough and lived carefully enough, I could become someone who deserved forgiveness, even if I never received it. The family I had destroyed was gone forever. The sister I had murdered would never come back. But maybe, Someday I could build something new from the wreckage, not a replacement for what I had lost, but something honest and real and worth preserving. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all I could ask for. Maybe that was how villains learned to live with themselves. Not by being forgiven, but by becoming someone who no longer needed forgiveness to exist. 3 weeks after the dinner, Sarah showed up at my apartment. I hadn't seen her since that night, hadn't spoken to any of them. The silence had been deafening, but also strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying anyone else's secrets or pretending to be someone I wasn't. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. The polished, confident woman who had walked into that restaurant was gone. In her place stood someone who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes replaced with jeans and an old sweatshirt. But it was her eyes that shocked me the most. They looked exactly like mine had for the past 10 years, hollow, lost, searching for something that no longer existed. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I almost slammed the door in her face. Almost. But something about the way she stood there, so broken and vulnerable, made me step aside and let her in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe deep down, I still remembered what it felt like to love my sister before everything went wrong. She walked into my living room like she was walking through a minefield, careful and deliberate with every step. I watched her take in my small apartment, so different from the sprawling house she'd grown up in, so different from her own penthouse downtown. For a moment, I wondered if she was finally seeing how differently we'd been treated, how different our lives had become. "I've been to see 3 different private investigators," she said, settling onto my couch without invitation. "I've had DNA tests done. I've been through every document, every record, every piece of evidence I could find." I sat across from her, my heart pounding. "And?" "You were right." The words came out like she was confessing to murder. "About everything. I'm not their biological daughter. Lisa Martinez was my birth mother. She died when I was 6 months old. And Mom and Dad, they took me in and created this elaborate lie." Hearing her say it out loud should have felt like vindication. I'd been right all along. I'd been carrying the truth while everyone else lived in a fantasy. But instead of satisfaction, I felt something I hadn't expected, a crushing wave of sadness for both of us. "But here's what I don't understand," Sarah continued, her voice getting stronger. "Why didn't you just tell me? Why did you have to destroy everything in the cruelest way possible? Why did you wait until I was surrounded by people I love to humiliate me like that?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. I'd been asking myself the same thing for weeks, and I still didn't have an answer that made me feel like less of a monster. "Because I wanted you to hurt," I said finally, the honesty burning my throat. "Because I've been hurting for 10 years, and I wanted you to know what that felt like. Because I was tired of being the only one carrying the weight of the truth." "But I never asked you to carry it alone," she said, tears starting to fall. "If you had told me, we could have figured it out together. We could have confronted them together. We could have been sisters instead of whatever this is." Sisters. The word hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time we'd actually been sisters? When was the last time we talked about anything real, anything that mattered? When was the last time I'd looked at her and seen family instead of competition? "I used to worship you," I whispered, the admission coming from somewhere deep and buried. "When we were kids, before I knew the truth, I thought you were the most amazing person in the world. I wanted to be just like you. I knew," she said softly. And I loved that. I loved having a big sister who looked up to me. But then something changed. You started pulling away, started looking at me like I was the enemy. I never understood why. Because they loved you more. The words came out raw and broken. Because you were their chosen child, their miracle, their second chance. And I was just there. The practice round before they got the real thing. Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Older, sadder, but also somehow clearer. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked. It's not finding out that my entire identity was a lie. It's not learning that the people I called mom and dad aren't my biological parents. It's realizing that my sister, my actual sister, the one person who should have been on my side through all of this, hated me so much that she chose to destroy me instead of trust me. Her words cut deeper than any knife could have, because she was right. In my quest for revenge, in my desire to make everyone else hurt the way I was hurting, I'd forgotten the most important thing. Sarah wasn't my enemy. She was my sister, and she was just as much a victim of our parents' deception as I was. I don't hate you, I said, though the words felt inadequate. I hate what they did. I hate the lies, the favoritism, the way they made me feel invisible. But I don't hate you. Then why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why did you do it that way? Why did you choose to hurt me instead of help me? I didn't have a good answer. I didn't have any answer that would make what I'd done okay. All I had was the truth, ugly and selfish as it was. Because I'm broken, I said finally. Because 10 years of carrying this secret, 10 years of watching them love you more, 10 years of feeling like I didn't matter, it broke something in me. And broken people do broken things. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across my living room. I watched Sarah's face in the fading light and saw something I hadn't seen in years. My sister. Not the golden child, not the favorite, not the chosen one. Just Sarah, hurt and confused and trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. I can't forgive you, she said eventually. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What you did? It wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. You planned it. You waited for the perfect moment to cause maximum damage. That's not something you do to someone you love. I nodded, accepting her words like the punishment they were meant to be. I know. But I also can't hate you, she continued. Because, despite everything, despite what you've done, you're still my sister. And maybe we're both victims here. Maybe we both got screwed over by people who were supposed to protect us. She stood up then, smoothing down her jeans and looking around my apartment one more time. At the door, she turned back to me. I'm going to confront them, she said. Mom and Dad, I'm going to demand the truth, the whole truth, about why they did what they did. And then I'm going to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with them going forward. And us? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. I don't know, she said honestly. I really don't know, but Rebecca, if you ever want to try to be sisters again, really try, you're going to have to figure out how to forgive yourself first. Because the person who sent that text message, the person who planned that humiliation, that's not the sister I remember. And until you deal with whoever you've become, there's no room for who you used to be. After she left, I sat in my dark apartment for hours, thinking about what she'd said. She was right, of course. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone driven by bitterness and revenge instead of love and family. I had let my pain turn me into exactly the kind of person I'd always sworn I'd never be. But knowing you've become a monster and figuring out how to stop being one are two very different things. And I wasn't sure I even knew where to start. The ripple effects of that dinner began showing up in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd been so focused on my immediate family that I hadn't considered how the truth would spread, how it would affect everyone in our extended circle. But secrets have a way of growing once they're exposed, like cracks in a foundation that spread until the whole structure comes down. It started with my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who called me 2 days after Sarah's visit. I hadn't spoken to Carol in months, but apparently the family gossip network was alive and well. Rebecca, honey, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, she said without preamble. Is it true what I'm hearing about Sarah, about her not being your parents' biological daughter? I should have hung up. I should have refused to discuss it. But after weeks of carrying this burden alone, part of me was almost relieved to have someone else asking the questions. Where did you hear that? I asked instead. Your cousin Jennifer saw the whole thing at the restaurant. She said Sarah collapsed, that there was screaming, that your father looked like he'd seen a ghost. And then Jennifer started putting pieces together, things that never quite made sense about Sarah's birth, about why your parents moved right after she was born, about why there were never any baby pictures. I closed my eyes, realizing that my moment of revenge had just become a family-wide scandal. Jennifer was Carol's daughter, and she had the biggest mouth in 3 counties. If she knew, everyone would know by the end of the week. Carol, I can't, because if it's true, she interrupted, then I need to tell you something. Something I should have told someone a long time ago. My blood went cold. What do you mean? I mean, I knew Lisa was pregnant. I knew she was struggling, knew she was scared about raising a baby alone, and I knew that when she died, there was a baby that needed a home. But your parents told everyone the baby had been placed with a family out of state, that it was all handled through proper channels. The room started spinning. You knew, I suspected, she corrected. But I never said anything because Sarah seemed happy. She was loved, she was cared for. She had opportunities she might not have had otherwise. And your parents seemed so happy to finally have another child after trying for so long. So you just let them lie? Let them create fake documents and move states and build an entire false identity for a child? I didn't know about any of that, Carol said defensively. I thought maybe they'd adopted her legally but just didn't want to deal with all the questions and complications. I thought maybe they were protecting her privacy, protecting Lisa's memory. I never imagined they'd go to such lengths to cover up the truth. But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. She had known something was wrong, and she'd chosen to look the other way. Just like I had, for 10 years. Just like everyone in our family had, apparently, when things didn't quite add up. There's more, Carol continued, her voice getting smaller. After Lisa died, there was supposed to be a life insurance policy for Sarah. Not a huge amount, but enough to help with her care and education. Your parents were supposed to be managing it as her guardians. Supposed to be? I tried to ask about it once when Sarah was in high school. I thought maybe it could help with college expenses, but your mother got very defensive, said it had all been handled, that I didn't need to worry about it. She made it clear that I shouldn't bring it up again. The implications of what she was telling me hit like a freight train. Not only had my parents stolen Sarah's identity, they'd potentially stolen her inheritance as well. The money, that was, meant to secure her future, had disappeared into their accounts, used to fund the very lie they'd built around her existence. Carol, are you saying they stole from her? I'm saying I don't know what happened to that money, and I should have pushed harder to find out. I'm saying I failed Lisa and I failed Sarah, and I've been carrying that guilt for 28 years. After I hung up with Carol, I sat staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd learned. The web of deception was so much bigger than I'd realized. It wasn't just my parents who had lied. It was an entire network of family members who had chosen silence over truth, convenience over justice. But the calls didn't stop there. Over the next few days, my phone rang constantly. Cousins, family friends, even some of my parents' neighbors. Everyone wanted to know if the rumors were true. Everyone had their own piece of the puzzle to contribute. My cousin David called to tell me he'd always wondered why Sarah looked so much like photos of our Aunt Lisa. My mother's friend Margaret mentioned that she'd thought it was strange how my parents had suddenly become so secretive about doctor's appointments and medical records after Sarah was born. Even our old family doctor's nurse, now retired, reached out to say she'd always found it odd that there were no medical records for Sarah's first 6 months of life. Each conversation added another layer to the deception, another person who had noticed something wrong but chosen not to speak up. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion, each revelation bringing down another piece of the carefully constructed lie my parents had built. But the most devastating call came from Sarah herself, 3 days after our conversation at my apartment. "They're not answering my calls," she said without preamble when I picked up. "I've been trying to reach Mom and Dad for days, and they're not responding. Their neighbor says they've been getting a lot of visitors, a lot of phone calls. I think they're hiding." Sarah, I went to their house yesterday. The curtains were drawn, the cars were in the garage, but no one came to the door. I know they're in there, Rebecca. They're just too cowardly to face what they've done. I could hear the pain in her voice, the frustration and hurt of being abandoned by the people who had raised her. It was the same pain I'd felt for years, but concentrated and amplified by the sudden revelation of truth. "I've been thinking about what you said," she continued. "About them loving me more, about me being the chosen child. And I realize now that it was never really love, was it? It was guilt. It was them trying to convince themselves that what they'd done was okay by pouring everything into me." "Sarah, no, let me finish. I've been going through everything. Old photos, documents, memories I'd pushed aside. And I can see it now, the cracks in the foundation. The way they'd change the subject when I asked about my birth. The way they'd get nervous when I wanted to do genealogy projects in school. The way they'd discourage me from getting too close to Lisa's side of the family." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "I found something else," she said finally. "I hired a forensic accountant to look into my finances to see if there were any accounts or assets I didn't know about. Turns out there was a trust fund, Rebecca. A substantial one, set up by Lisa before she died. It was supposed to be managed by my guardians until I turned 25, and then transferred to me." My stomach dropped. And it's gone. Every penny. Transferred out over the years for educational and living expenses. Except the amounts don't match what they actually spent on me. Most of it just disappeared into their personal accounts. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of this new betrayal. It wasn't enough that they'd stolen her identity, her history, her connection to her real mother. They'd also stolen her financial security, her inheritance, the one thing Lisa had been able to leave for her daughter's future. "How much?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "With interest and proper investment, it would be worth about $800,000 today." I felt sick. $800,000 that should have been Sarah's, that could have given her true independence, true security. Instead, it had funded my parents' comfortable retirement, their nice house, their expensive vacations. "I'm going to sue them," Sarah said, her voice steady now, resolved. "I'm going to take them to court for fraud, for theft, for everything they've done, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of people they really are." "Sarah, are you sure? Once you start down that path, there's no going back?" she finished. "Rebecca, there was no going back the moment you sent that text message. There was no going back the moment I learned the truth. The only choice now is whether I'm going to let them get away with it or whether I'm going to fight for justice." After she hung up, I realized that my moment of revenge had set in motion something much bigger than I'd intended. I'd wanted to hurt my family, to expose their lies, to make them pay for the pain they'd caused me. But I hadn't considered that. The truth would have its own momentum, its own consequences that would spiral far beyond my control. The family I'd grown up in was gone, destroyed not just by my actions, but by the weight of decades of deception finally coming to light. And while part of me felt vindicated, another part of me wondered if any of us would survive what came next.